All right, let's get started here. My name is Stephanie. Welcome to NATOA's webinar with Circle and Philanthropy. If this is your first time joining us, we're excited to have you. You'll notice that this looks a little bit different than a normal Zoom meeting. It is a Zoom webinar format, so you can see us, but we can't necessarily see you or you each other. There are Q&A boxes and chat boxes on your screen. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to send them in there. I am excited to introduce you to Kris and Shireen, and I will hand it off to them to get started. So welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome, everyone. It's so good to not see you, but to know that you're there and see your names. My name is Shireen Munshi. My pronouns are she and her. My ancestors are from Zambia, Scotland, and India. And I'm calling in from unceded Algonquin territory, where there's a fresh layer of snow outside that looks very, very nice if you're into the cold. I will be doing these slides during the call today. That's my role, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A for the Q&A session at the end. And I'm really excited to get started and pass it off to Kris Archie.
Kiksham, wait quite up. Kris Archie Rinsquest Sequatum de Gelmo from Teskin. Hi everyone, I'm Kris. I will be the person chattering away at you for the next hour. I'm planning to leave enough time for some Q&A. I use the pronouns she and her, and I welcome the use of they and them as a demonstration of solidarity for using non-gendered language because it's actually totally possible and it creates a more inclusive space for others. On my mom's side, my community is Teskin, known as Broken Rock, and it's in the central interior of British Columbia, and I'm of the Sequatum Nation. On my father's side, my father's fourth generation settler Canadian, and his family benefited from the gift of land that didn't belong to them in southern Saskatchewan, and homesteaded both as farmers and ranchers in and around communities known as Ravens Crag and Maple Creek. It's always important for me to share the fullness of who I am and where my family and community are, and the ways in which we've both been harmed by the legacy of colonization and how the legacy of colonization has had a good impact on some of my family members. So living in that tension, being aware of it and naming it is an important part of my personal practice. I am living in the illegally occupied space known as New Westminster, which is a municipality in the lower mainland of British Columbia. And the closest kind of nation in and around this community is the Kakite First Nation. But not too far from my home, just over that way, is the Fraser River, which is a space of gathering and connection and sustenance and ceremony for many nations in and around this area. So I'm really thankful to be here with all of you. And although I can't see you, I can see lots of lovely names. I would really welcome folks to use the chat box and to give yourselves, to write a couple sentences to introduce yourself. So feel free to use the same format that we have here, which is your name, your pronouns, a sentence or two about your ancestors, and the traditional name of the territory where you live, work, or play. And I'll let folks add that to the chat. And just one piece to add, we ask people about, in this way related to live, work, and play, because we often prompt settlers to recognize the relationship that they might have to land, which typically exists with where they have property, the land that they use for recreational purposes, you know, like skiing or golfing, perhaps, or hiking. And it's also an acknowledgement that many people until 2020 actually didn't live in the same community that they worked in. So that's part of our invitation there. It's not meant to be flippant or overly playful. It's meant to help people understand the myriad of ways that they're in relationship to land around them, and that all of that land is likely someone else's unless you're of that territory yourself. Great. I trust that there are some folks who are adding their introductions into the chat. I hope I can't see, but I'm hoping that that's what's happening. So you can at least be connected to one another. The format for this session is, as I said, you'll hear me chattering on about what is philanthropy. We'll be showing some slides, and we can make these slides available to folks, but this session is also being recorded. And so it will be available to NATOA members on their website, and we'll also at the Circle make it available to our members. So just know that if you have to take a call or like feed a kid or deal with a pet, don't worry. If you miss anything, you can come back to the recording and find it. So I'll be showing slides, and as I said, hope to get through them fast enough that folks have an opportunity to ask some questions. There is a Q&A kind of space where you can ask questions, and so Shireen will be monitoring that as well. Feel free to use the chat box to also ask questions as they come up. You know, I might answer some of them as I'm going along, but we'll definitely make sure we've got space at the end of our session. Sound good? Okay. Great, so over to the next slide. So first of all, what the heck is philanthropy? I don't know about you, but the first time I heard this word, my mouth stumbled over it. It's just a funny word. And so here's a little bit of information about it. The root of the word philanthropy comes from Latin, made up of two words, philo, which is about love, and anthropos, for mankind. And so it literally translates to love for mankind. So I like to begin by helping folks understand the distinction between charity and philanthropy. Charity is typically more emotionally driven, and it's focused on supporting the immediate needs of people. Charity is an important function of civil society. It's been around for a long time, well, you know, well before it had that kind of a name. But for me, it's important that the distinction between charity and philanthropy is that philanthropy is meant to help address root causes of issues and concerns. And typically, philanthropic endeavors seek to engage in advocacy for change, or at least support the kinds of individuals or initiatives that do that work. And so it's meant to be building a stronger, more vibrant civil society. In addition to that, philanthropy in the context of Canada is usually the term most used in reference to the giving of financial support to charitable organizations. However, broadly, people talk about how philanthropy is not just about money to organizations, it's also about the gift of time, talent, and treasure. So, you know, so for example, if you are a volunteer at a local community event, or perhaps you sit on the board for an organization, that in and of itself is an act of philanthropy. That's a gift of your time. Perhaps you have specific skills, like you're a CPA, or you're really good at basket making or beading, and you share that talent with others at a community center or in your own home. That's another act of philanthropy. And so I think it's really important to also share that philanthropic behavior shouldn't just be about the conversation connected to money, but typically it is. And that the primary focus for philanthropic organizations is to give money to registered charities or qualified donees, which in many ways greatly limits the ways that Indigenous organizations, projects, or grassroots solutions get funded. And that's for a variety of reasons, which we can get into further or in another session. But I just wanted to drop this information here. So go to the next slide. Here's the thing about philanthropy. Indigenous practices, laws, and teachings have been around since the beginning of time. And we know a few things as Indigenous peoples about how to redistribute wealth, how to make sure that we have teachings about greed and hoarding transferred to our children, so they learn how to take care of the community and not just keep things for themselves. So a couple of examples: potlatch ceremonies are widely recognized as sophisticated systems for wealth redistribution and maintaining social balance and cohesion in communities. Wendigo stories are often used as stories to make sure that folks aren't being greedy, that they're not being cannibalistic in their behaviors. And so in many places, teachings of greed come with Wendigo stories. There are stories here in the West Coast about ravens stealing the sun. And in many ways, this could be seen as an act of philanthropy, of bringing light to the benefit man. stories of coyote, in my language, seklep. Seklep is a trickster, and there are lots of stories and wisdom about the tricksters among us and why it is that we need to learn about and pay attention to the behaviors of tricksters in the work that we're doing in our communities. And then last but certainly not least, I often tell a story about my younger brother, who is a deer hunter, and the way in which his deep practice of harvesting a deer, of like going hunting and harvesting a deer, preparing that deer, and then distributing all of the elements of that animal to our community is in fact a demonstration of reciprocity in action, of being in deep philanthropic behavior, because he's in quality relationships, not only to himself and creator, but to his family, his community, and to his giving. So I welcome folks to use the chat box to share the name of a teaching or a law related to generosity, sharing, or greed that you might have in your community. And for those of you who are trustees on Indigenous Trust, you might have like a particular value that actually guides some of the work of your trust actions. So welcome you to add that to the chat box as well. Oh, another thing I would say about this particular slide is the stance that we have at the Circle on Philanthropy is that Indigenous communities know best how to take care of their communities and actually have many generations of wisdom and practice and laws related to sustainable connection to our kin, the feathered, the hooved, the human, the plant life, and in many ways, the act of colonization has severed those practices through the theft of land, the continued theft and extraction of resources in a myriad of ways, and the intergenerational harm of residential schools and the 60s scoop, et cetera. We've had these kind of teachings and ways of being kind of severed. However, they still exist inside of us, and many of us still have access to the wisdom about how to be in a right relationship and to be in relationship of reciprocity with one another. And I think that this wisdom is something that the settler philanthropic sector can learn a lot about in their desired connection with our communities. Okay, to the next slide. So in our communities, this is some of the form that it takes. You're participating in buying Indian tacos. You might like throw in chip-ins for sports team, a few bucks here or there, or like making sure that you've got your bottles outside so the kids can come get them as they fundraise for a hockey tournament or a ball tournament. Some people use Chase the Ace to fundraise for community members or family members who are facing a medical emergency and have to travel out of town. Community bingos happen all over the place. And they're often fundraisers for, in my community, there's a big one every year that's a fundraiser for the kind of Santa Claus parade, so that every child in our community gets a gift from Santa Claus as well. Indigenous trusts are a prime example of the ways in which teachings and laws govern reciprocal behavior and giving back to community. If you're fortunate enough to be close enough to your uncles, sometimes they'll empty their pockets, give you the cash or the change from their pockets. And if you're in a more northern community, you might benefit from the distribution of narwhal or of other kinds of medicines, berries, and moose meat if you're lucky. So these are the ways in which our giving is happening. And in lots of ways, when we talk about philanthropy in Canada, these behaviors and practices of how we're taking care of one another are often undervalued, not just undervalued by settlers in relation to Indigenous communities, but often undervalued largely for all kinds of racialized and equity-seeking communities. Like queer communities have generations of history of taking care of one another. Black communities have many demonstrations of ways in which they pool money together and take care of community and send kids off to school, et cetera. So feel free to use the chat box and like send an example of how Indigenous philanthropy shows up in your community. I'm just going to take a quick look here at some of what's in the chat. Squares, that's right. Selling and buying squares. Fantastic. Vina Brown is here. That's really exciting. I'm wearing Vina Brown earrings today, unknown to the fact that that this amazing artist would be here. Congratulations on the Yellowhead collaboration. So exciting. If you don't know what that is, go Google it. It's very exciting to see that happening. Fantastic. Okay, so head over to the next slide. Great, so you've already heard me say this, but I'll say it again here. We use the language of settler philanthropy to indicate when we're talking about settlers in their mindset and behaviors of philanthropic giving. So for us, we distinguish this behavior from the values and teachings that I have or that I'm aware of and witness in Indigenous communities because it specifically, their wealth has been built on the lands and on the backs of Indigenous peoples, not only here in Canada, but internationally, globally. Settler philanthropic wealth tends to be intergenerational, and in many instances, not only historically, but currently are involved in either investment practices or extractive business practices that allow them to build their wealth. And so often what's missing from their narrative is that the stories and the practices behind wealth accumulation was actually on the lands and on the backs of others. And so we use this language with a lot of intention and to ensure that the broad philanthropic sector understands that when the circle says philanthropy, when we say settler philanthropy, we're talking about and pointing them to the direction of how their wealth was created and accumulated, and that it can't be separated. They're good. The good of them giving their money cannot just be separated from the harm in which they gained their income and the ways in which they continue to invest it, for example. Thank you. To the next slide. So I want to share a little bit about the types of settler philanthropic organizations and the ways that they give. So a prime example would be community foundations. If you've never heard of community foundations, they are typically organizations that are constrained in their financial giving by geography. They're place-based, typically. And one of the benefits of community foundations is they tend to make their decision-making and grant-making processes far more visible than other kinds of grants that could be available. As well, more and more of them are working to actively make space for Indigenous folks to engage on their grant-making committees. As well, more Indigenous folks are being invited to sit on the boards of settler philanthropic organizations, and even some have staff. Myself, I used to work at the Vancouver Foundation, so for 5 years, I was the solo Indigenous person in that organization. But during that time, they also engaged a couple of Indigenous board members and continue to try and do that good relationship building work. Community foundation priorities are often set by their boards, and they generally are quite focused on local issues and causes. Typically, they're only going to give to registered charities and qualified donees. If you don't know if there's a community foundation near you, I recommend finding out. So do a Google for is there a community foundation in your community? Take a look at what they're focused on supporting. Then there are corporate foundations. So MasterCard Foundation is an example. MasterCard Foundation is a member of the circle. Corporate foundations typically use the income earned from their business, and they designate a portion of it to philanthropic giving. So some corporate foundations, just like accept grant applications and send money out the door, while others, in some instances like MasterCard Foundation, they actually operate specific programs themselves, which would include hiring teams and staff to deliver services on the ground in community. They sometimes invest funds in research and provide advocacy support at a policy or a legislative level, depending on the issues they're focused on. So, you know, an example of this is MasterCard Foundation has a program called ELEV, which is focused on supporting Indigenous post-secondary education and Indigenous-led education initiatives. And they've partnered with fantastic hosts of Indigenous-led organizations and institutions across Canada. So that's an example there. Some other examples of corporate foundations would be Suncor has a foundation, PetSmart. Absolutely, the place where you go and buy your dog food or your kitty litter from. PetSmart has a corporate foundation as well. And similar to community foundations, they're typically quite focused on giving only to registered charities or qualified donees. However, corporate foundations do have some flexibility in their giving, and that's important to note. Corporate social responsibility, people try not to use this language, but it is what it is. And so a couple of examples of places that have corporate social responsibility kind of baked into their work and their business, their brand, so to speak, would be, you know, Lululemon and Lush Cosmetics. So really, these are groups that are truly driven by amplifying their good. However, the bottom line typically is focused on driving more consumption of their products and services. Some are truly doing good work and changing their approach. Lush has been working very hard to build meaningful and long-lasting relationships with Indigenous-focused causes. And Lululemon, we recently worked with them to grant over $1 million, specifically tied to the notion of reparation payments to the 3 host nations where they began their business and to some urban Indigenous programming. And so corporate social responsibility can sometimes have more flexibility to give to non-registered charitable organizations than others. Private foundations, these are made up of a few different kinds of, in a few different ways, but typically this is inherited wealth that tends to focus on specific causes, geography, or concerns. Decision-making of private foundations tends to be more private, and many continue to maintain that the board of these organizations are usually family members. You know, very few of them have open calls for applications or even demonstrate transparent application processes. They're not kind of required in the same way as other kinds of philanthropic organizations to behave. However, some of these groups, like the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, was created by a group of rogue nuns. They used their wealth in real estate to create a foundation focused on environment, housing, and adult education. And then organizations, private foundations like McConnell and Laidlaw are both trying to engage non-family members, both at the board level and at the grant making decision level, which is really important, right? Because these are like old family foundations who are white folks making decisions about how to create change in the world and investing money in institutions and programs that will influence policy and programs that might touch in our communities. And so to see more and more Indigenous and other equity seeking folks in those spaces is really important. And then finally, individual donors. You know, one example I like to share about individual donors is this this hashtag on Twitter called Settler Saturday. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but effectively on Twitter, there's a hashtag called Settler Saturday, and it's an invitation for settlers to give their money directly to Indigenous folks as a demonstration for how they can, you know, put their money to use directly to folks. So these might be to individuals, to charities, to organizations, to grassroots groups. If you're on Twitter and you're curious, you've never seen this, check out hashtag Settler Saturday, and you'll see that people are just saying like, hey, I need funds for these things. And then people send money. So it's like a quick, direct way that folks give their funds. But additionally, There are more and more individually wealthy people and or families who are not creating private family foundations or investing their money or putting their funds with community foundations or other groups. They're actually moving to give their money directly without the tax benefit and often without requiring registered charitable status for their giving. There are more and more folks who are bringing a lens for their philanthropic behavior to be less about charity and more about wealth redistribution, because they recognize they have an inequitable amount of wealth, and so their responsibility is to redistribute it rather than distribute it for the aim of tax receivable benefit. Go to the next slide. So I wanted to share this information. This is really important information, especially for Indigenous trusts who I think operate slightly differently than this. So the general settler-philanthropic organization operates like this. So we'll take X Foundation. Let's say that X Foundation has $1 billion endowment. That means that they have an asset base of $1 billion. So they use that asset base to invest their money, and say they gain a 10%, they have a 10% gain on that income. Well, that's $100 million. The federal government, they're the ones who set the laws on this. They mandate that foundations must redistribute or grant 3.5% of their total gains. That's the minimum. That is the legally required minimum. Many actually meet the minimum, and that's about it. And there are a handful and more who are going to maybe 5%, but typically they're doing the bare minimum. And so that's 3.5%. That turns into $3.5 million of grant making for the year. Woohoo, right? But wait a second, what happens to the rest of the fund? Those funds, the gains, they gained $100 million. Well, that money sits in the bank and continues to build wealth. So X Foundation ends the year with 1 billion plus the 96.5 that they've gained in interest earned. So the reason I think that this slide is important is because this is a bit of an inside scoop to how many settler-created philanthropic institutions behave more like they're an investment manager than they are a philanthropic giver. So I think it's really interesting for you to ask yourself, what percentage of the gains for your Indigenous trusts are you paying out annually? Are you paying out 3.5%, 10 or 15%, 50%? I think it's important to consider that our sense is Indigenous trusts actually pay out far more than 3.5% of their annual gains back into their communities. Another thing that it's important to see here is to just ask the question about how many Indigenous trusts are utilizing their annual grant dollars to work with the settler-philanthropic sector to match funds. So for example, if you have $150,000 and it's a grant that goes to your language program every year, what could you do if you had double that amount? What would it look like if you went to a settler-created philanthropic institution and said, we have an amazing program and we fund $150,000 a year, would you match it? This is something that could be done if the invitation is made. So since many settler philanthropic organizations require, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the grant funds to come from other sources, Indigenous trusts have a massive opportunity to think about how to leverage their giving to their community anyways, and have it matched by settler philanthropic organizations. Next slide. Show me the money. So what does this all mean? How is it connected to actually just getting money into the coffers for your organization? That's an important question. So typically there are what are called open calls for grant applications. This is usually like someone probably in your community is like searching all the time, where can I write a grant and get money from? And so someone's like filling all the papers, and then if, maybe 6 months to a year later, a check shows up, or someone says, hey, we got a grant. And then you have to figure out kind of who wrote the grant and what are the responsibilities, what's the reporting, et cetera. So open calls for grant applications usually have 2 stages. They have a letter of interest, which is the first stage. It's basically like, what's the gist of your idea? And then if accepted, you move into a second or a longer stage, which requests far more information. Grant applications generally require several pages of questions to answer, submission of budget documents, and previous audited statements. Now, this is something that's really important for non-qualified or for qualified donees to consider, is that sometimes a request for audited statements is going to like make some other departments in your community a little cranky. So it's really wise to think about like which department is the program connected to, which level of audited statements are required to be sharing, because truly settler-philanthropic organizations shouldn't have the inside scoop to the full financial audited statements for a nation, for example. So all that to be said, different types of settler philanthropic organizations have different methods for making decisions about who's funded. So typically community foundations, they have advisories of community members who help them decide. The diversity of those community members varies based on the community foundation. And then some foundations, their decisions are made by board trustees. Often those are family members, while others are completely private, and there is actually no public knowledge required to be shared about their process for decision making. So I put secret handshakes there because absolutely many funds flow based on who you know, who you have relationships to, and who you can build a longstanding connection with. Lots of organizations over many years have been just like in a relationship of funding that comes from like being in the right place and knowing the right people. And of course, there is an inequity to that because we're talking about folks in this country who carry a large amount of wealth. They're predominantly male and they're predominantly white. Donor intermediaries, I want to talk for a second about them. So they're really important to know about because they offer typically a service that enables folks with money to give to organizations or projects that want and need money. However, it's really important to get some critical thinking going about how they're funded, who's getting paid, what are they being paid? Are they taking a fee from the donor, or are they taking a fee from the funds that have been raised? So a couple of examples. You know, United Way, for example, typically raises funds. They have large annual campaigns. They raise funds on behalf of specific populations or perhaps some folks experiencing poverty. However, there's often very little leadership from board, senior management, or programs for the communities of people they seek to serve. However, I have to say that Winnipeg United Way is one exception to this that we're aware of, where they have Indigenous board members, senior staff, and Indigenous staff in programming, and have long-standing, I'm talking decades long-standing relationships to the Indigenous charitable sector in and around Winnipeg. But largely, many intermediaries, they make it easy for folks to set up accounts, to put money in the accounts, and to give funds to organizations. And they can be really helpful for small organizations because they take care of the legal things sometimes, like making sure that people get a receipt if they donate a certain amount, etc., which is like an onerous administrative thing, but is necessary. But it is important to think about working with intermediaries and understanding the pros and cons of doing that work, and how and seeing whether there's an opportunity to negotiate that they waive their fees in the release of funds to the work that you're focused on. There we go. Oh, I have to also say, I have this thing at the bottom that says other charitable organizations. I have to be really clear here that there are also organizations, like a charitable organization, who will like sometimes sidle up to community and say, hey, you know, we see that you really care about you know, the trees, and so we want to help you care for the trees and take care of the trees. So will you be our partner? It's really important to know that there are organizations who are showing up, sidling up to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit organizations and work, because it actually builds their credibility as an institution. It allows them to raise more money on behalf of Indigenous people and their issues and causes. And it's important to just be really on the watch for this kind of behavior, and to ensure that there are actually opportunities to be in the leadership role, be in a power brokering role, rather than allowing another charitable organization to raise funds on your behalf, maintain the donor relationships, and actually put the money through their organization rather directly to your nation. And so, we've seen all kinds of examples of this happening. There's a lot of it that happens in environmental organizations. However, we've also seen it in health and child welfare nonprofits. Folks who will do research into understanding the priority of the community, and these can be predatory and sometimes quite one-way relationships. So they're important to just be aware if someone shows up and it sounds a little too good to be true. Be sure to ask some good, tough questions. Great, to the next slide. So here's the big question. How can Indigenous groups engage with settler philanthropy? There's a little fly here. Let me get rid of that. Okay, I'm gonna have some tea too. Okay, so I know the rule of 7, that you should only have 7 things on a slide, but bear with me. Okay, so there's kind of 3 buckets here, and I'll expand on each of them. So back in 2015, when the TRC wrapped up their last national gathering, there was a group of individuals, both Indigenous and settlers, who recognized that the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action didn't explicitly name the philanthropic sector as an actor in rectifying the harms that exist. So a group of folks got together and they wrote what's called the Philanthropic Communities Declaration of Action. Hold on a sec. I have this lovely mouse pad here. And so this declaration for action actually was really focused on making sure that philanthropic organizations learn about the calls to action, but also learn more broadly about the history of harm to Indigenous folks. And they've effectively said, we really care about this issue. We want to make sure that these calls to action are met. So a bunch of folks signed this declaration, and we have a list of the people who've signed, the list of philanthropic organizations who've signed this declaration on our website. So I really recommend you go and take a look. These are folks who say, we care about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And so in our view, they're kind of a great first place to go for funds. They said publicly they care and they want to help. So I think it's important to find the declaration, take a read through it, and check out the list of signatories on our website. Use the language of the declaration to inform funders about how your work aligns. So for example, if a funder has signed this and the work that you're doing is about language, well, you know that that's related to a particular call to action in the TRC. And so using the language of the declaration to say, hi, we're so-and-so, we saw that you signed this. We're really great that you care about the TRC calls to action. We're working on call to action, whatever number. We'd really like to know how we can be a partner in this work. And so using that language, request a conversation to understand how that funder would like to support your work. This is a little different than waiting for their announcement of a grant application, filling out all the papers, and then waiting 6 months to a year to find out if you got money or not. It's an invitation to think about how to engage differently from a position of power. The other thing that we recommend is to become a member of the circle. There are no membership fees for Indigenous-led and Indigenous-focused charitable organizations. That's because we charge philanthropic organizations a large membership fee. Their money is not really their money. And so that means that Indigenous organizations shouldn't have to pay to be in relationship to these settlers who are required actually to give of their wealth differently. So it's really easy. There's a membership form, and then you sign up for our newsletter, and then you get information and invitations to our gatherings. You have opportunities to participate in dialogue and build relationships of value with charitable or with philanthropic organizations who have said publicly and demonstrate through their budgets, through their staffing, through their programming, that they actually care about and want to think and do their work differently alongside Indigenous partners. So we give that opportunity to folks if you're a member. So please become a member. And then finally, I think it's really important to amplify your solution and innovation. So it's important to do your homework in relation to meeting with funders, help make it easy for them to understand the connection between their goals and your innovative solutions, and never sway from being aligned to your cultural values and focus on the long game. I think that it's really important to go into these spaces and, you know, don't show up with your hat in your hand. Don't be willing to accept pennies for your bold dreams. Another, don't bother cold calling. I don't know if you've been on the other end of a cold call from someone who's like, hey, like, we want to chat, we have money, or we want money, or like, who can I talk to? It almost never gets anywhere. Another don't is to just recognize that using anger or frustration or leaning on the white guilt that sometimes emanates or exists for folks is not that helpful, because that bad feeling only lasts for so long. And we know that the best kind of generosity requires feeling good and being in a different quality of relationship. I want to just expand as well on this language about being Indigenous-led and focused. So understand and position your organization as being Indigenous-led, which for us means having Indigenous leadership at board and staffing, demonstrate cultural practices, worldviews, and priorities in the work, typically have deep relationships of accountability to land and community, and that solutions for the work come from within these communities. These organizations are typically those that demonstrate through their action and behavior that they honor the dignity and the sovereignty of nations, and as well, you know, are really focused on amplifying the leadership of Indigenous solutions for what we experience in our communities. Indigenous informed organizations are those that might have some Indigenous board members and Indigenous senior leadership, and perhaps they have program staff working on a specific cultural program that are from that community. But they may be hosted by a registered charity or on a shared platform service. Indigenous informed is for those places where there's like actually a really deep and meaningful connection between a settler created charitable organization and an Indigenous grassroots group or project. And we've seen some really beautiful things come out of those kinds of connections. However, why we have these designations is that there are all kinds of large organizations with really sophisticated, highly paid development teams or fundraising teams who actually seek out money based on like the audience that they want to serve. And so we call organizations who do this those that have Indigenous beneficiaries. So they typically say that they offer services on behalf of Indigenous peoples. However, there's typically little to no governance or operational leadership by Indigenous people. There's little to no community relationship or accountabilities. Ultimately, these are the kinds of large organizations who don't have any aunties to tell them to smarten up and knock it off, because actually they shouldn't be qualifying for the large amounts of funds that are actually meant to go to Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed organizations. So it's important to notice if you've got groups like that kind of showing up and saying, hey, like, we want to give you some money, you want to make sure that you're asking critical questions about how they got it, what percentage is actually going to you, and even asking to see the grant application for how they said they were going to work with Indigenous communities. So getting ready to close, I just want to say that it's really important to acknowledge, as the circle does, that Indigenous communities have the solutions for what we face in this world. We recognize that systemic racism and ongoing harm of colonization has an impact in our communities that is deeply felt by us, and therefore the best solutions will come from us. So we like to support our members to show up from a position of power and strength, to ensure that they're actually being coached and supported to be in a relationship with funders who actually want to do their work differently. But I also just think it's important to really just stay connected to your values and be fully prepared to walk away from partners or funders who don't understand your projects, walk away from organizations who demand your labor to teach them, or who are overly curious about the things that you're doing. Because in some ways, those are behaviors that are about extracting your wisdom and solutions for their own gain. So, you know, we've been here for a long time. We're still here. We're going to stay here. And at the end of the day, the settler philanthropic sector, they need us and our solutions and our innovation, not only for the issues that we experience in our communities, but actually for all of humanity. So they need us more than them. So don't be afraid to walk away when your needs aren't being met in a relationship. So that leads us to the final slide, which is just a deep thank you, Kukshem, from me and my organization, the Circle on Philanthropy. I want to create some time now for some questions and answers, but you have our contact information there for more information. I hope this has been a helpful, quick overview of the settler philanthropic sector in this country as well. I hope that you consider learning more about our organization and the ways that we seek to build a different quality of relationship between Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed organizations for accessing wealth in this country. Kukshem, thank you. I'm going to have some more tea and look at the questions. Oh, never mind. There's all kinds of questions, but they've been answered.
So far, they were all requests for a copy of your PowerPoint.
Oh, great. Yeah. Fantastic. And so we can share the slides. I probably won't share the notes, but also remember that this webinar is recorded, and so it can be shared with other with other Indigenous trustees, with your boards, with other community partners as well. And in many ways, we hope that this is the first of many kind of partnerships with NATOA, but also more and more of our work in the year to come will be focused on supporting Indigenous-led charitable organizations to learn about the settler philanthropic space. Great. So I see a question here about being the key philanthropic partner for a health authority. And I hope we can play a more constructive role on settler philanthropy than what you're outlining. Absolutely. There are all kinds of ways in which settler philanthropy is showing up alongside Indigenous partners and doing amazing work. The most successful examples we've seen is when Indigenous partners are actually put in a position of power and authority for decision making about when, where, and how funds are used. And so we definitely recommend that in those partnerships, they should be really focused on how you share and build and wield power differently to ensure that the best quality decisions are being made. And largely for settler philanthropic organizations, so our organization, we do a lot of work with settler philanthropy, teaching them to understand the ways in which white supremacy shows up in their organizations and helping to coach them to understand how it's their own programming, it's their own systems, it's their own grant applications that are the barriers to building quality relationships. And so we do support organizations to think and do differently in that space as well. Great. Yes. This question from Scott, do you work with Indigenous-led qualified donees? Yes. Absolutely. I see there that Shireen has just put our website in the chat, as well as a link to our membership form and a link to the declaration as well. So hopefully you'll find those things and can share them. There's our Twitter feed, all kinds of good stuff. I see another question. Awesome. I'm glad that folks found some value in this. This is a new offering for us, and it was a good exercise putting together the slides and the notes and just thinking about like how to make sure that we're sharing information with Indigenous individuals and organizations to just understand the landscape a little bit more. Thank you. Oh, some open questions. There's a couple of questions here about urgent changes for the settler philanthropic sector, and for someone who's saying they're part of a community foundation that wants to engage with Indigenous communities, but are worried about interfering with those First Nations by funding one over another to do work that could create conflict. So there's a couple of things here that's really important. One is that if you've done your homework well, no, I'll even go back one more step. If you're a foundation that's funding education initiatives and you're doing your research about who to fund, you're looking at organizations probably who can demonstrate a relationship to the issue, that has an accountability to the people that they're seeking to serve. And you also probably accept that there are different ideas about how that work can be done. And so you might even invest your grant making dollars in a couple of very different kinds of ideas related to education. Interestingly, what happens when folks want to start funding, say First Nations issues, is they'll say, well, those natives, they can't agree on anything, so we're just not going to fund them at all, right? And I'm exaggerating a bit here, but you get my point, that same kind of spaciousness for alternative options for how to do the work doesn't get given to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit organizations and projects in the same way. And so that's an important thing for a settler philanthropic institution to recognize in themselves. The other thing is actually to think about your relationship, the opportunity for a relationship with Indigenous, with a nation, should be more than just giving a project grant. Think about the way, if you're a community foundation, what is your relationship of reparations to that community? If you're a community foundation based in an area where the wealth came from individuals who lived in that area, who extracted the resources of the land to build intergenerational wealth, you might have a different conversation than saying, we're a little worried about wanting to fund one project over another. That actually being in a direct relationship to the nation about paying reparations rather than grants for small projects could be another way to demonstrate that you're willing to work differently in the space. And then this other question about urgent changes in settler philanthropy. We say some things over and over again. One is it's really important to build meaningful relationships to Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed organizations and initiatives. There are a whole bunch of folks who want to get along well with Indigenous peoples and organizations. And so they want to build a partnership and a relationship. And we keep telling folks, you know what? We're kind of busy. Indigenous organizations are chronically underfunded, often under, increased scrutiny, not only by the public, but by the CRA, amongst other things. They're dealing with multi-jurisdictional funding and reporting and legislation that impedes their ability to do their work well because of the systemic and discriminatory policies that continue to exist, especially in places like education, child welfare, and justice. So one of the best things that settler philanthropy can do is just do a look around at which Indigenous-led organizations exist in your landscape and fund them abundantly, and do it with as few strings attached as you can to just say, that you recognize the value of their labor is not only just to their communities, it is to the entirety of all of our communities. And if you want to be in partnership with them, first make sure that they've got the kind of funding that allows them to have a strong organizational infrastructure. Make sure that their staff are being paid well. Make sure that they have funds to offer RSPs, pension, health and wellness benefits. Make sure that they're in office spaces that are like good for their health and well-being. That is going to be the best thing that you can do to start building partnerships. Additionally, absolutely, the labor, so much of the labor and learning that is required by settler philanthropic institutions is actually stuff you can do on your own. Understand the ways in which white supremacy shows up inside of organizations and then makes its way into the policies and the practices that make the decisions about who gets funding and who doesn't. Do what you can to analyze the data about who you give money to and who you don't. Pay attention to, if you give money to Indigenous issues, how many of those Indigenous grants or those grants earmarked for Indigenous organizations actually went to Indigenous-led organizations versus those that are actually have Indigenous beneficiaries. The other thing to do is take a look at your data and find out, of the money you gave to Indigenous organizations, compare it to the money you give to white-led organizations and understand the financial discrepancy. Do you give smaller grants for less amount of time with higher restrictions than you do other organizations? That's a really important data point that helps drive some change in practice and policy. So those are a few quick things there I just wanted to share. Hope that helps, Gordon. There we go. And folks are just really keen for the slides and other pieces. So those will be available to you. I think we're good here.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kris, for all of that important information. This recording will be available for NATOA members in the member portal, and I believe Kris will be putting it up for their members as well, so it will be out there if you missed any of the details. I will follow up and share Kris's PowerPoint if she's okay with that. This is the final NATOA webinar for this particular series over the winter. We will be back at a later date with more webinars, but if you've been with us all along, thank you so much. If this was your first one, I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much to Kris and Shireen for all of the work that they put into putting this presentation together. We really appreciate it, and we're excited to partner with you here at NATOA.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you, Shireen, for your work in making this presentation lovely and work smoothly as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.